Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I want to talk about big books and whether or not I like them. It may seem somewhat ridiculous for someone whose favourite author is Charles Dickens to suggest that they might not love big books. Obviously, to a certain extent, I do like big books. There are a lot of very large, long Victorian books that I adore. These ones, for example, this is a lot of my favourite books here in a giant stack. They're all huge. But I did want to make a video talking about book length and size. This is partly a video response video, old school style. Simon from Savage Reads made a video a couple of weeks ago talking about whether size matters in books, which I'll link down below because it was a really good video. So I'm partly making this video because that video made me really think about the way I feel about long books, but also because recently I've read a couple of long modern novels which I really didn't like, namely The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber and The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and both of them, one of the reasons among many why I didn't like them was because I felt they were too long. And it made me realise that actually I cannot think of very many modern novels that were really long that I loved. The exceptions that spring to mind would be The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton and Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, and also The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. So I feel like fantasy is a slightly different boat sometimes. Most of the really long contemporary books I've read I haven't actually ended up enjoying that much, in comparison to a lot of really long classics which I love. There are two things I want to talk about here. One is why I tend to love long, big classics much more than long, big modern books, and also to talk about why I think I feel much more hesitant now picking up long books than I did when I was a teenager. A lot of my favourite Victorian novels, or at least a lot of my favourite Victorian novelists, I discovered when I was a teenager, and I first read when I was a teenager. And as a teenager, I had no qualms about big, long books. Like, I had no fear of them. I liked long, big books best. I read Les Miserables when I was 15, and that just like didn't bat an eyelid. That was just like a nice normal length for a book, apparently. All of Dickens I read when I was a teenager. The first two Anthony Trollope books I read amongst some of his longest. Like, I loved big, long, chunky books, and I never had any hesitation picking up a really, really long book. And I think now I have much more hesitation picking up big, long books. I think that's partly a time thing, to do with the amount of time I have to read, and also especially I think to do with the amount of time I have to read at home. I probably had slightly more time to read as a teenager, but also like I did more of my reading at home, whereas now I do nearly all my reading on my commute to work. And you know, if you do carry around a 1,000-page book in your bag, it's really quite heavy. And I also think it's partly to do with being older and being part of BookTube and being much more aware of how many books there are out there that I want to read, having many more books on my shelves that are unread, and being exposed through BookTube to so many books that I really, really want to read. I think that does make you think about the ways in which you spend your time for reading, and I mean, Simon spoke about this in his video. If you can read one 1,000-page novel or three 300-page novels, sometimes you're more likely to read three 300-page novels because that is more books. And I think it's partly to do with a kind of, not exactly a sense of achievement, but I do feel on BookTube that I wouldn't have as much to talk about in a monthly wrap-up if I read like 4 really long books in one month rather than like 10 medium-sized books, or a mix, which is probably what I usually do. I usually read a mix, but I do read more short books, I think, since I joined BookTube, and it's partly to do with having more books to talk about and like a Goodreads challenge thing and trying to read more books, and also like a TBR thing as well, I think, because if you have a lot of books, unread books sitting on your shelf, then if you read 3 shorter books, you feel like you've got through more of your TBR and you're making better progress on like getting through the books you want to read, rather than if you read one long one, even though like in pages it's the same. And also I think if you put a lot of time into a book, a really long book, and you don't like it very much, it's quite gutting. It's more gutting, I think, than if you read a really short book, which you don't really enjoy. Like if I read a 200-page book and I feel kind of either like meh about it, or like, I know I didn't really enjoy that one, that's kind of okay because it only took me like 2 or 3 days to read. Whereas if I spend 3 weeks on an 800-page book, like I did with this one, and I didn't like it, I then feel like I've wasted time where I could have been reading so many other things, and it's kind of more grating. I feel like I dislike this book more for the fact that I had to spend lots of time on it. I think I do have certain apprehensions now about reading really long books, and I think it is partly to do with time and BookTube and wanting to read a lot of books in a year, and I think it's also partly to do with fear that if I don't like that book I'll have invested much more in it, especially because I'm not very good at DNFing. There are books that I've started and not finished, but more due to a lack of time or the fact that they're incredibly heavy in my bag and really long and daunting like War and Peace. But I almost never, like I don't think I've ever given up on a book because I wasn't enjoying it. And I think one of the reasons why I don't have as much apprehension now about picking up long Victorian books is because I don't always have the same fear, because For the most part, though not always, like I like most of the Victorian books I read, and there are some exceptions like George Eliot. For the most part, I really, really enjoy Victorian literature, or even if I don't enjoy it, I find it really fascinating, so I kind of don't mind putting the time into it. And I know that like I have less fear going into a long Victorian book that it's going to be like, I feel like I wasted my time. But long Victorian books just don't really scare me because I kind of know what I'm getting. It seems to me that I love big Victorian books, but I don't tend to love big modern novels. Not always, there are exceptions to both. And also I'm much less hesitant about picking up long Victorian books than I am about picking up long modern novels. And I think it's partly to do with form, because most of the Victorian books I read, most of the big chunky fat Victorian books were serialised. They were published in a serialised form at the time, which means they actually have a very different form. Like they're almost like a different thing. Like they're not the same as modern novels. Like they are almost like a different medium, and they tend to be structured very, very differently. If you think about most of the really like the really long Dickens books that were published like every month for a year and a half, they tend to either have a lot of characters and a lot of subplots, or take place over a really long period of time, or both. So Dickens writes books like Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House, which take place over a couple of years and have so many subplots, so many different characters. It's not just like we have 2 or 3 main plot lines, like there are a good sort of 10 plots going on, I would say, in both of these. There are a lot of different plot lines. Or we have something like David Copperfield, which does follow one protagonist through his life, but spans, you know, a good 20 or more years of his life. You can see the same in Anthony Trollope novels like The Way We Live Now or He Knew Who Was Right or The Last Chronicle of Barset. They have a lot of different plots going on. Because of the serialised form, Victorian books often are plotted slightly differently to modern books. Like I feel like what the premise of a contemporary book is tends to be revealed much faster, and publishers are looking for the premise to be revealed much faster than in Victorian serialised books, where the stakes of the book often change quite a lot over the course of the book, and often characters can end up in different places. Often I find when I'm describing a Victorian novel, it's really hard to actually say what the book is about without telling you something that happens a third or even half the way through, because often things change quite a lot in terms of the plot, whereas I feel like, not always, but often that's easier to do for modern books. Like that tends to be less the case, though I know there are exceptions. Modern novels, at least British novels, possibly excluding sci-fi and fantasy, do tend to be a lot shorter than Victorian novels. And I think that is a lot to do with form and what is kind of favoured by the market, I guess, at the moment. And I do think that it means that long modern novels often are not dealing with as many characters or as many subplots or are spanning as long a period of time as the long Victorian books are, which is why I often read long modern books and feel like they're way too long and like they could just do with a lot of cutting. Like Michelle Faber's The Crimson Petal and the White. It doesn't have that many plot lines and it doesn't take place over kind of more than a year, and it felt for me a bit repetitive and it felt for me a bit just too much, just too long for the story it was telling. The same with both of the Donna Tartt books that I've read, The Goldfinch and The Secret History. They're both quite claustrophobic. They are both first-person narrative dealing with one person and a small group of people around them. The Goldfinch takes place over quite a long time, though The Secret History doesn't really, but they just don't feel like they have enough in them to warrant being that long. If a book is going to be really long, for me it has to have a lot of characters or span a really long period of time or deal with like a lot of plots. It has to be really wide and epic, I guess, which is one of the reasons why I love The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, because that book has like 14 main characters. It needs to be as long as it is. At the same time though, when it comes to modern novels, sometimes I do read a book and think it's too short. There are books like Sarah Winman's Tin Man, which I read and I really enjoyed, but I just didn't feel like it had quite enough in it. Like I kept on waiting for other things to happen, and I feel like that's a book that's sort of about 200 pages long, and I feel like if it had been 100 pages more in depth, dealing more with the characters, I would have liked it more. Like I said, I often read contemporary literary or historical fiction and think this book is too long, but I also quite often read contemporary literary and historical fiction and think this book is too short. So I think my ideal for a novel, at least a contemporary novel, is probably like 300 to 500 pages. I think that, where it's like a decent size to get a lot in, but is also like not too long for the story it contains. Although there are some really short books that I really love, so, you know, I don't really have many conclusions from here. I just thought it might be interesting to have a discussion about this, especially because I do read a lot of really chunky, massive old books, but when it comes to reading new books, I'm much more tentative about picking up those really long, chunky books, and I tend to like them a lot less. I think that's all I had to say. Let me know down in the comments if you like long books, and if you find that your relationship with long classics and long modern books is different at all, and if you feel differently about them. And I think that's all I had to say, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.